From the American journal Physical Anthropology, we read, the pre-dynastic of Upper Egypt and the late dynastic of Lower Egypt are more closely related to each other than any other population. As a whole, they show ties with the European Neolithic, North Africa, modern Europe, and, more remotely, India, but not at all with Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Asia, Oceania, or the New World.
I didn't want to respond to this video, but many of you requested my reaction. Unlike last time, I won't react directly to the entire video. It would be too time-consuming and possibly overwhelming for many viewers. Instead, I'll focus on the main arguments presented in the original video and debunk them one by one. Let's delve into the heart of the debate, the blackness of ancient Egyptians. Contrary to what my detractors claim, I will address all their counterarguments directly and debunk them live. No need for emotional manipulation or appeals for sympathy. We'll annihilate the issues head-on. Today, we will not use any other tool than the one presented in the beginning of this video. The one that is supposed to debunk us. I won't bring anything new, and yet we will still be right at the end. So, get your popcorns and make sure to watch the video till the end. The video presents the study claiming that ancient populations of North Africa resembled Europeans and Middle Easterners, suggesting that people looking like modern Europeans lived in ancient Egypt. This argument is now used to claim some type of crazy diversity in ancient Egypt. However, most people overlook a subtle trick employed by scientists to obscure the truth. Let's replay that excerpt and see if you noticed it.
From the American journal Physical Anthropology, we read, the pre-dynastic of Upper Egypt and the late dynastic of Lower Egypt are more closely related to each other than any other population. As a whole, they show ties with the European Neolithic, North Africa, modern Europe, and, more remotely, India, but not at all with Sub-Saharan Africa, Eastern Asia, Oceania, or the New World.
Did you catch it? If you did, pause the video and share your observation in the comments below. Okay, now let's move on. To provide the answer, let me ask you a question. Have you ever wondered why scientists use terms like Neolithic Europeans instead of simply saying Europeans, or Mesolithic Middle Easterners instead of simply saying Middle Easterners? The origin of the people doesn't matter. They could be Europeans, Americans, Middle Easterners, Asiatics, etc. What's crucial here is the term that precedes the descriptor. In the case of the excerpt, it's Neolithic. It could have been Mesolithic Europeans or Neolithic Middle Easterners. What's significant is the time period indicated by Neolithic. At first glance, it might seem like this term is added to provide context by specifying a time frame, right? But that's not the primary reason. Now, you might be wondering what I'm talking about. Well, the real reason is that Neolithic Europeans are not modern Europeans. You might think I'm crazy now, but let me explain. When most of us hear Neolithic Europeans, the word that grabs our attention is European, not Neolithic. I'm pretty sure most people don't even know what Neolithic means. We might have a vague idea, something like ancient times or ancient Europeans, but we don't know exactly. We just understand that they looked like Europeans. Metatron even used that segment to now introduce white people in the mix of the original ancient Egyptians of Nakata.
And second, it's really difficult to just use cranial or bone examination and just say, yeah, they were all black, they were all white, they were all olive skin, Middle Eastern, what have you.
Let's delve deeper. Europe has a complex history, even more so when scrutinized closely. Most people believe that early human beings who lived in Africa left the continent, settled in specific locations, and remained there until modern times. This implies that all current populations of the world are direct descendants of the early settlers of their respective regions. This belief mirrors the misconception I've addressed in many of my videos, that early human populations experienced rapid and drastic changes in skin color as they migrated out of Africa. According to this common belief, the original human beings, who were black, left the African continent and transformed upon reaching the Middle East to resemble the current populations of the region. Then, upon reaching Europe, they became white, while those who migrated to Asia developed what are referred to as Asiatic phenotypes. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The people living in Europe today, whom I'll call modern Europeans, are not identical to Neolithic Europeans. The modern ones are mainly descendants of a group of people known as the Yamnaya people, who belonged to the Ar male lineage. Here's a genetic map of Europe today. You can clearly see that the main male lineages are R1b in the west and R1a in the east. And here's a genetic map of Europe during the Neolithic. Notice the difference? If you look carefully, you will notice that none or very few of the lineages that dominated Europe during the Neolithic period remained. And those who survived became minorities or mutated then were pushed around the edges of the map. While our lineages which were inexistent in the Neolithic became the dominant force. Obviously, something happened. According to European scientists, after 3000 BC, nomadic pastoralists from the steppes of Eurasia replaced and interbred with the Neolithic European population. But this statement is not entirely accurate. Initially, the common thought was that the Yamnayas eliminated most of the previous populations. Later on, Professor Johannes Krauss from the Max Planck Institute came back with a less violent narrative, saying this.
But we see that there is a second genetic turnover, there is new genetic material that comes probably from Central Asia, from a region that is north of the Black Sea, north of the Caspian Sea, from the steppe belt. So that it comes with cattle herders that come into Europe and then bring new genes into Europe. And then basically all those three different populations, the indigenous Europeans, the hunter-gatherers, the early farmers that came 7,500 years ago, and those people that came about 5,000 years ago into Europe, they admix. And this happens in what we call the Bronze Age. And this genetic makeup that comes out of this mixture that happens about 4,000 to 5,000 years ago is what we find in all Europeans today. So every single European population today has all these three genetic components that until 10,000 years ago were completely separated. They were European, Asian, and Near Eastern. And then 4,000 to 5,000 years ago, they all mixed together.
So according to him, they were not killed, but that it became a beautiful melting pot. However, this is still not entirely true. Here's why. In terms of lineages, there are male and female lines. And men couldn't procreate with other men, right? So, if there was a melting pot, it might have been solely between men of both groups with the women from the opposite group, right? But there is another detail that scholars are not telling us. Research proved that the Yamnayas were mainly a group constituted of men. Basically, these men were raiding and conquering in groups of men, meaning that they were taking women from the lands they conquered. And since the original male lineages of Europe disappeared, it means that they didn't have many descendants. In other words, they were not able to procreate, and their lineages drastically diminished. Archaeologists also noticed a rise of deaths caused by violent acts during that time period. In other words, the skeletons from that period were damaged by weapons, implying huge conflicts. So, if we connect the dots, it becomes obvious that these original European men were replaced for the most part, due to numerous events. A few years ago, scholars announced that modern Europeans' genetic makeup emerged after those events that occurred after 3000 BC. This means that modern Europeans can't be linked to anything, any accomplishment, or any civilization that existed before 3000 BC since they didn't exist yet. Here is a graph showing all male lineages ranked chronologically. The four first ones are African lineages, they still exist and are still carried by Africans. And if you look towards the end, you'll notice the Ar lineage. It is one of the two youngest lineages. It appeared very late, which confirms what I just said previously. Remember that the Neolithic spans from around 10,000 BCE to 4,500 BCE, and that ancient Egypt was already being built prior to 3000 BCE by indigenous Africans. So, any study mentioning Neolithic Europeans and linking them to North Africa or to the Middle East isn't talking about current white Europeans. It's about these ancient black populations or black-related populations who freshly migrated from Africa through the Middle East and settled in Europe prior to the Yamnaya invasion. If you have doubts, here is a facial reconstruction of a Neolithic European man known as Cheddar Man. He lived in the UK, which is Northern Europe. It's evidence that the original inhabitants of Europe were dark-skinned. But Cheddar Man is linked to the Mesolithic, the period preceding the Neolithic. So we may need another example. Here is Otzi, also called the Iceman. It is the natural mummy of a man who lived between 3350 and 3105 BC. Here's what some artists said he looked like. But that's another lie. Here's what analysis of his remains said. So he was very dark-skinned, meaning that even after the Neolithic and the arrival of Middle Eastern farmers, Europeans were still very dark-skinned, contrary to what is said in the media. Even those living in the Ötztal Alps at the border between Austria and Italy, the country of Metatron. Neolithic and Copper Age Europeans were black or dark-skinned. And if we connect them to Northern Africa and the Middle East, we get that ancient North Africans and Middle Easterners were black like Africans and didn't look like modern Europeans. But maybe this is still not enough. So let's go deeper. While making this video, I decided to search for more data, and I stumbled upon the following excerpt from Johannes Krauss from the Max Planck Institute himself. Let's listen to what he has to say.
What we can also do is this principal component analysis that I showed you before, which people had done on this saliva from Lausanne and from London. Now, this is not done on the people from Lausanne and from London that were genotyped on the street, but this is from all those populations that we have gathered together, those 2,900 people from all over Eurasia. So this all presents different individuals from different populations here. And what we see here now is not all 2,400. Those are only the Western Eurasians. So those are populations from the Near East and from Europe. So you see many different populations here. Those are all the Near Eastern populations that built this kind of cloud that you see here. Those are the modern Europeans. In between, you have some Mediterranean populations. And that was one of the first patterns that we recognized when we plotted this together. We can actually see there's almost like two clines. There's a cline here, and there's a cline there. And in between those two clines, you have this Mediterranean populations. But those Europeans actually look quite moved from here there, right? They kind of like look like moved into this direction. So they were moved in this direction. If you then look what is in this direction, what actually is plotting here, which basically those people could be mixed off from this component with something that is down here. You see, those are all the hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gatherers are actually quite distinct. No population we have in Europe today looks like hunter-gatherers, looks like the native or indigenous Europeans, especially those Western Europeans, the one from Los Spur, as well as the one from Spain, La Braña, the one with the blue eyes and the dark skin. They're like down here. They're quite distinct to all modern populations we have in Europe today. What we have down here are our early farmers. Our early farmers, indeed, again, look like certain populations in Europe. And no surprise, we've seen that before with the Iceman, they look like Sardinians. So people in Sardinia look genetically like the first farmers. That has been replicated now many times. So this is basically people here from Sardinia. They're almost indistinguishable from people that were the early farmers that came maybe about 7,000 years ago to Europe.
So, as you can see, even the most advanced European scholars are admitting that Neolithic and post-Neolithic Europeans have nothing to do with modern Europeans physically, and they look more like Africans, meaning that they were black. This means that the claims mentioned at the beginning of the video don't link ancient Egyptians to modern Europeans who are white, but rather to their black predecessors, thus confirming the blackness of ancient Egyptians who usually depicted themselves with dark colors. It requires a deeper understanding of these words and concepts to grasp their true significance. When we only scratch the surface of these complex matters, it's prudent to refrain from discussing them. Otherwise, we risk misinterpreting the results and inadvertently misleading others. That's why I strongly advise Metatron to take some time off for study and reflection. It's evident that he lacks a thorough understanding of the subject matter he's addressing. This is my final recommendation, given his assertion that he isn't attempting to manipulate his audience. It simply suggests his ignorance on these matters. My intention is to offer sincere guidance because further discussion without proper understanding could lead to more embarrassment over time. So, what the results suggest is that a portion of modern Europeans' genetic makeup is derived from these ancient Africans who left the African continent through the Middle East and settled in Europe.
So the early Europeans, we know that by now, they all had blue eyes. So the hunter-gatherers, they all had blue eyes. We haven't found a single hunter-gatherer yet that did not have blue eyes. And they mostly, especially in Western and in Southern Europe, all had dark skin. So basically looking potentially like Africans today.
But despite that genetic connection, there is no or little phenotypic connection, meaning that they do not share similar physical characteristics. Evidence that populations' appearances change through time. Something that can also be applied to all parts of the world, especially ancient Egypt compared to modern Egypt. It's crucial to remember that studies of lineages in ancient Egypt and among the Natufians, settlers in the Levant, reveal their affiliation with haplogroup E, a sub-Saharan lineage, which the great majority of Black Africans and African Americans still belong to today. However, here, in addition to this genetic connection, we also observe a phenotypic resemblance with Black Africans. This connection has been demonstrated in my previous video and is reaffirmed here, even when using my opponent's counterarguments. Keep in mind that in Europe, the Neolithic men, despite having a black appearance like Africans, mostly belong to haplogroup I, which is not associated with ancient Egypt nor modern Egypt at all. I hope that you enjoyed this video. Do you agree with my conclusion? Do you believe Neolithic Europeans were black? Do you believe they were distinct from modern Europeans in terms of physical appearance? Or am I completely wrong? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Let's have a good conversation. Thanks for watching Mr. Imhotep's channel, and see you in the next one.